Just wait one more minute. All right, I'll begin now. Welcome to our November Masterclass, Horses in Heat, Horses in Bushfires. My name is Claire and I am the Programs Lead at Vets for Climate Action. Tonight, we will hear about the impact the heat has on horses from Equine Medical Specialist Dr. Lidwien. We'll also hear from Canter for Climate's Rebecca Gorman, Diana O'Donnell, and Amy Curran as they share their experiences with horses in bushfires. We'll learn about action plans in case of fire, suitable emergency kits, and how to care for horses with burns. The agenda for tonight will be approximately 7:10 to 7:40. We'll be hearing from the ladies from Canter for Climate. And from 7:40 to 7:45, we'll have an introduction to Dr. Lidwien. And from 7:45 to 8:15, Dr. Lidwien will present. And then there will be a chance for questions with the speakers from 8:15 to 8:30. Before I continue, I would just like to acknowledge and pay respects to our First Nations peoples, past, present, and emerging. Traditional owners have cared for this country upon which we work and meet for over 60,000 years, its land, oceans, trees, grasslands, and its wildlife. We endorse the Uluru Statement and acknowledge that this land has never been ceded. I would like to mention that Vets for Climate Action would not be able to do what we do without the support of our incredible volunteers, our donors and partners, such as Number One Australia, the leading full-service national distributor of natural pet products, Leica, which is a natural dog food, and so many more, including the Advanced Queensland Ignite Fund. I wish I had time to thank everyone, but there's just no time. Just some quick housekeeping before we do get started with the masterclass tonight. Please ensure you are muted throughout the presentation and ask questions in the chat, but remember that there is a time for questions at the end. If we miss your question or you would like to know more about Vets for Climate Action, please email info@vfca.org.au. This webinar will be recorded and shared after the event for those who are unable to attend. It will also be uploaded to our Vets for Climate Action website, as well as our YouTube channel. If you do not wish to be recorded, please do not feel the need to turn your camera on. All right, let's get the masterclass started. We'll go for the first presenter.
Over to me, Claire.
Yes, please.
Thank you. My name's Rebecca Gorman. I'm with Diana O'Donnell and Amy Curran and Lynn Turner. We've set up Canter for Climate. And first of all, I just want to say how excited we are to be on a webinar with Vets for Climate Action. This is our very first webinar, and we're just thrilled that vets are hosting us. So thank you very much for helping us organise it and for being the host. We really appreciate it. Canter for Climate was set up in order to better support people who own and love horses, to better support them in their awareness and understanding of climate change, but in particular, how they manage their own land. We know that if we can cool our land, we can have a small impact on the climate. And I know that sounds simple, but almost impossible to achieve, you might say. But in fact, horse owners own a lot of land as a group. And generally, we're one of the worst land managers of all. I'm also a cattle farmer, and I know that I have a much harder time managing the grass and ground cover of my horse paddocks than I do of anywhere else on the farm. And so one of the things that we're doing, which perhaps deviates slightly from, say, Farmers for Climate Action, is working hard on what we can do on our own properties. And so on the website, we've got some case studies up, some people who have had some great progress with their ground cover, and then some terrific fact sheets about how we can better our land, because there's lots of complications, as you know. The more grass you have, the more chance you might have of laminitis and so forth. So it's a complex area to manage land and horses, so we really acknowledge that. In the future, we hope to get to some advocacy as well. But in the short term, as we're building our community, we are just hoping to look at this land management issue, and then we'll progress from there. So one of the issues, though, of course, in managing climate is this change in temperature, these extremes that we're experiencing. And I think many of you might have experienced some of that, certainly on the East Coast today, with the storms that have come through. We're talking tonight about the opposite of that, when well, actually, often there's a storm involved as well, isn't there? When bushfires hit, and how we might better prepare for that. So I'm going to throw across to Amy Curran now, who herself has lived through quite a number of bushfires and the preparation and evacuation. I've lived through one frantic evacuation of about 36 horses from down to the Camden Equine Centre, and but had lots of help, and it was smooth and it worked really well. But I can only imagine what it might be like if it doesn't go well. So we've got some great resources that we're going to be putting up on the website, and that Diana O'Donnell is going to talk about a little bit later. But I'm going to throw to Amy to take us through her story. Thanks, Amy.
Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. My name's Amy Curran. I'm here to talk about my personal experience with bushfires. And, thank you for giving me the opportunity to do so. Unfortunately, I was involved in one of Australia's biggest bushfires, which was the 2003 Canberra fires. I was living in Canberra at the time. I had my horses on agistment. I only had one horse that was actually mine on agistment, but I'd trained several others for other people, so they were in my care. I was working at Exhibition Park there, looking after the horse section of the Canberra show. As most of you might know, it was in January. The Royal Canberra show is in February, so it was quite a busy time for us at the showground. All systems would go there. And I remember going outside and just smelling smoke. That was the first thing that I noticed that was off. And you have to remember that 2003, this was before Facebook. Nowadays Facebook knows everything before the news does. So we didn't know what was going on. We could smell smoke. We didn't know where it was coming from. We didn't know what was happening. So the first thing I did was leave to check my own horse, who wasn't very far away down the road, north side of Canberra. The horses there knew what was going on as well. They knew something was wrong. The horses were agitated. And that was really interesting, that the horses did know. They could tell the difference between, sitting outside having a barbecue and they're not stressed near their paddock to, they knew something was wrong. The big hack that I had at the time, he had already pulled a shoe off when I got there. I think because he was agitated and he must have been pawing at the fence, which was really unlike him. He was really good at keeping shoes on. So I spoke to the property owner. There were a couple of horses in stables. We figured that there was some sort of fire. We didn't know how close it was. So the first thing I did was make sure that all of our horses were in their paddocks, make sure that the water troughs were full, and I took the rugs off. And they were the three things that I did before I even knew how close the fire was. I raced back to work. By this point, you know, we did know that there was a major fire. It was down in the vicinity of Stromlo. There were a lot of agistment centres down there. My mind just went to how many horses were there. I knew how many horses were there. I'd taught a lot at a lot of those agistment centres. So the next thing I did was I went home and I got the float, and I hooked up my float and I just started driving, which might have been crazy. But at the time I knew my horses were okay. For the fire to get to my horses, it would have had to burn Canberra City. So, you know, it wasn't an immediate likelihood that that would happen. So I set out to try and help other horse owners, students' horses, friends' horses. We got a few trips done. There were others that did the exact same thing. I went down there to try and help people that I knew, but how it worked out, we just ended up taking any horse that was there, that was close by and ready to go, because we could see the fire. We were that close. We knew it was inevitable that the roads were going to be closed. I thought people were probably stuck at work. They weren't able to get through. So we started taking horses to Exhibition Park. I don't actually remember whose decision that was, but I think I might have just told people to do it, even though it was outside of my realm of authority, but that's what we did. A few weeks before the Royal, just take horses to Exhibition Park because it was north side, it was safe. I got, I think 3 trips in. On the 4th trip, we were turned around. They'd closed the roads and that was it. We couldn't do anything else. So I went back to Exhibition Park and tried to lend a hand there. The yards and stables were full of horses. We didn't know whose horses they were. They were just horses that people had gotten out. We had no water buckets, you know, so we were just trying to find water buckets and food. There were vets on site, from the Canberra vets down there. They were only down the road, so they were on site. To help, they were treating the horses that were clearly sick. Minor injuries, we sort of anyone dealt with that we could. So it was a really confronting time getting the horses there. Over the next few days, we continued the care of the horses. News got out that how many horses actually hadn't survived. We still don't know the exact number, but it's thought it's between 40 and 50 horses didn't survive. We went back into the area after the fire to check if there were horses there that had, when the roads were opened, that may not have had grass to eat because it may have burnt. But yeah, I won't go into details on what we saw, but there wasn't any horses alive that we could take at that point. So our efforts after that were concentrated back at the showground. Over the next few weeks, we had to organise gear drives because of the nature of agistment properties in Canberra. A lot of people have sheds there that have their gear in, and not only their food, their tack, their saddles, their rugs, their everything that they own that they need for their horse had gone. So myself and a couple of friends, we coordinated a gear drive. So 2 weeks before Canberra Royal, my office was full of saddles and horse rugs, and it was great. I was a very valuable employee at that point. But we did help a lot of people. And it was hard because there wasn't Facebook. You know, it was very hard to work out what people needed, and how to help them with that. So I can answer more questions about that at the end if anybody has any. But that tied me into preparation, because it was the first major fire that a lot of horse owners had to deal with, and it was a big one. It was huge. Nobody knew what to do. Everybody was just trying to figure it out as we went along. So there were inquiries afterwards. by the government, yada, yada. But, you know, I set out myself to, okay, this might happen again, because this was in Canberra. Like, who would have thought that there'd be a bushfire in Canberra? You know, you'd think it'd be out where I am now. Like, you'd think it'd be in the bush. So I started to do my research and, you know, what could I have done better if this happens again? I'm always going to have horses. It's likely that this is going to happen again. So after that, a few years after that, I moved to Oberon, and we had a 400-acre property in Oberon. And at the time, at this particular time, I had about 16 horses. We were breeding. I had a stallion and some mares, a couple of foals, and at this particular moment in time, a mare due to foal. And on the news came that there was a fire in the Blue Mountains, and it had gotten as far as Clarence, and it was moving very fast. From our property, we could see very, very thick smoke. Visibility was, maybe 20 meters in front of you, if that. So although the fire wasn't close, it was close enough that it was, you know, something to worry about, something to be prepared for. I had a double horse float, that was all, and I had 16 horses. So my decision in this particular case was to leave the horses. And the main reasons for that was the property size was 400 acres. I could still contain them within the property. I didn't have to let them out on roads, which is, you know, not something that most would recommend. Every paddock had a dam, and quite a large dam. And most of the paddocks were clear of bushland. It wasn't a very bush dense property. So that was the decision I made. I monitored them as best as I could. Thankfully, the fire didn't affect our property, but it came pretty darn close. But I was confident that my horses had the room that they needed. If it did get close, they had water sources and they had areas that were free of scrub. So that was the first fire after Canberra that I prepared for. These things seem to follow me around. So then I moved to Taralga. I've been in Taralga for 2 years now. And my horses now, well, I won't answer how many I have right at this moment, but at the time of this next fire, I had 9 horses. And the property that I manage that the horses are on is 40 acres in size. So quite a different size. I hadn't actually had a chance to think about what I would do in case of a fire at this particular property, because I hadn't been here very long. And my partner's in the local RFS. So we got an alert saying that there was a fire at Currawheela, and it was moving quite close, which is about 15 kilometers away from where my horses are. And a couple of friends said, oh, don't panic, Amy, it's 15 kilometers away, that's miles away. Well, I told them that it has been proven that embers can go up to 40 kilometers. So it was very real for me to be prepared. I had actually, even though I didn't have a bushfire plan set in stone, I had done some test runs with the horses in the float, just in case for any other reason I needed to evacuate as well. So originally I thought, I always knew that I would move the horses from this property if a bushfire came. That was my number one. And the reason for that was the difference in property size. It was a much smaller property at 40 acres. The paddocks are quite small. They're broken up into small paddocks. And every paddock has a small plastic water trough. So they were the factors to me that ideally it wasn't, it wasn't going to work leaving the horses there. The chances of their survival in a small paddock with a small water source was not high enough for me to leave them there. So I'd always decided I would move them. I've got a 3-horse angle load float now. I knew all my horses floated. That's the first thing that any horse I handle learns, is how to float. And And I thought, though, that I could do 3 trips. I thought with 9 horses, I've got a 3-horse angle load float, I can do 3 trips. I'd worked out that the property that I would most likely go to is a good friend of mine who has enough land at Tarago that the horses could go there. But I worked out that getting the horses out was going to take me 12 hours. So these are the sort of things you need to think about in preparation. Type into your maps where you think you're going to take the horses to, put that distance down there and return to get the next load, but add time for the float. And also add time that a horse that may usually float well, may not float well in times of stress. And that goes back to my big grey horse, who was usually a pretty calm horse and never threw a shoe, to the first smell of smoke, he'd ripped one of his shoes off in the fence. So those sorts of things. So when I did my practice run of the horses in the float, I realized, and I did always know this about this horse, that she was a little claustrophobic, but we've got a big Clydesdale mare, an older Clydesdale mare, and she gets quite claustrophobic. On a hot sunny day, the other horses will be in the shelter. And she won't. She will not go in that shelter. She doesn't, because she's a big mare. She doesn't like things over her head. And she's a little bit iffy going into the float, but she's always gone on. So I thought she'd be fine. As it turned out, when she didn't want another horse beside her, even though it was an angle load float, because every time she went to spread her legs, she'd touch the other horse. Or she'd touch the rubber, or she'd touch, and, you know, a lot of horses that scramble, they like to spread out their legs as well in the float. So that made her very insecure, very stressed. There was no way I could have put in a 3rd horse on the float with her because she was moving her legs out to the side of the empty bay. So that was just an example of, you think you know your horses, and you think, you know, that they'll all go on the float and everything will be great because that's what they always do. Have a practice, because I didn't realize that she wouldn't have allowed another horse near her. I thought my biggest issue was going to be getting her on the float. But it was, in fact, there was no way that she was going to let me put a horse on both sides of her and her not be able to stretch her legs out. So things like that. So when I decided to take them, the first thing that I did was make sure that they were close to the float, because there is a back paddock that's a little bit larger. So I put them in the smaller paddocks close to the float. I took summer rugs off. There were a couple of horses that had summer rugs on. I took those off because, again, embers, you don't know where they're going to go. You don't know where they're going to land. None of my horses wear halters in the paddock anyway. But if they did, I would have removed halters. In the front of the float, I put as many buckets as I could. Even if you don't have enough time to put food and buckets in your float or in your truck or your car, put buckets. Because a horse can go much longer without food than they can water. And I won't say too much because there's a vet in the room. I'm sure the vet can talk more about that, but it was buckets. We needed a lot of buckets, and whatever room I had left, that's where the hay went. Thankfully, I didn't need to take them anywhere, but I was well prepared in case I did have to. And just, one other thing that I'll go into about floating. In an emergency and getting your horse on the float that may not have been on a float, can I just say one thing that sounds really common sense, but it's not? Make sure you train your horse to walk backwards before you teach it how to load onto a float. Because and it sounds really funny, but there were horses that we were able to get on the float that didn't know that, the little push in the middle of their chest meant they walked backwards now and they were stuck. And that takes up valuable time. So all these little bits and pieces that, you don't think of, but I guess the take home is you can never be too prepared. So we've taken a lot of the guesswork out of it for you, learn from what we've been through. We have developed a bushfire template which will be on the website, which, you know, Diana will talk more about it, but it's basically a checklist. It's a Word document, so you can add your own things to it. You can add who is responsible for what. Don't rely so much on the who's responsible for what, though, because you might find it's just you. In the case of, you know, my partner working for the RFS, it was going to be me. So that was basically all I wanted to say, and just be here to, to answer questions. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention when, you know, and this is a little bit confronting, and I did hesitate and ask whether I should mention it, but the other thing is, if fire does move fast, in case of the Canberra fire, a confronting decision that you may have to make, and put this in your bushfire plan, is if you've got several horses and you know you're going to have to do several trips in your float to get them all out, you unfortunately need to write down the order that you will take those horses in. And that was probably the hardest thing for me to do. When I decided that, yes, I would take the horses, I wrote down trip 1 and the horses' names, trip 2 and the horse's name. And that's really confronting, because you don't know how close the fire is. I knew that my round trip was a couple of hours that it'd take me to get back. If the fire moved faster than what I could, if I wasn't well enough prepared, I may have only got 2 out of 4 trips in. So as confronting as it is, this is the reality of a fire. And if you've got that information written down, it'll help you to make, you know, an unemotional decision, a decision that you've already well thought out, not a rush decision, but it'll also help anybody else that's helping you evacuate horses. It'll give them a clear guide to help you as well with exactly what you'd thought out would happen. And there may be sentimental reasons for the horses, you know, on trip 1, but there may be logical reasons as well. If you've got a horse that you know isn't a good floater, and may take a little longer and may be a little bit more difficult, maybe pop him to a later trip to not delay the other horses that are easy to get out. All right, so I think I've covered everything I want to do, but yeah, hopefully you guys might have some questions at the end. And now I'm going to throw to Diana O'Donnell.
Hi everyone, Diana here. I'll just muck around while I screen save. And anyway, the reason I'm talking here today, I can't start. It's saying I can't start screen sharing. Now I can. Yeah, talking to you today is that I've lived all over Queensland. So currently down in southeast Queensland at the moment, but have lived, you know, right out to Longreach up near Cairns. I've had 40 years experience in agricultural and natural resource management. I've been a horse rider most of my life, but only a horse owner for about the last 20 years. But for the last 10 years, I've been an active firefighter with the Queensland Rural Fire Service. So I'm on about the theory. I fight fires, but I've luckily never had to evacuate my own horses from a fire yet. Okay, the big one everyone's got to do is that decision of, do you stay and defend or leave early? And it's not a simple single, I will stay or I will go. There are many situations when it would be safe to stay, but others when it would be essential that you leave, and leave early. If you plan to stay, you need to know how you're going to defend your property. This should be clearly set out in your bushfire survival plan for your family and your property. For advice on developing those survival plans, you can see the website for your local state fire service. We do have links on our fact sheet that we've done on horses and bushfires that's available on our website. Links for that will be given later. And as Amy was talking about, we do have a template for how you will do it, like your plan, how you write it out. So the fact sheet's covering all that we're covering today. And then, you know, you can write out your own plan. having that clear handwritten document allows you to share your plans easily with your friends and neighbours. I mean to add that, okay, the State Rural Fire Services will give you how to do your property and your personal plan. Our template is purely on your managing your horses. Okay, so this written document, the most important thing, it means that you don't have to think about what you're going to do when you are extremely stressed. As Amy pointed out, when you can actually see fire, where you've got smoke that you can only see 20 metres ahead of you, is not the time to be trying to make decisions. Decide early in a calm situation and write it down. And if it's all written down, you don't have to remember everything later. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. Oh, sorry to interrupt, Diana. I'm not sure if we're not seeing your screen. Do you want to try and share it again?
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm just presuming it's there. What are you seeing?
Just all of our lovely faces.
Okay, go back to Zoom. This one. Share screen. Oh, okay. I'll just go back. That's what I was just talking about. Can you see it now?
Perfect. Yep. Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay.
That's perfect.
That's what I was just talking about. So basically, don't wait till a fire is near to start planning. Have the planning done, and then don't wait till a fire is visible to start acting as well. Often the recommendations is if it's bad forecast for the next day, it's going to take a while to move, you might even move even before a fire has actually started. Okay, now to assess your risk of whether you need to go or need to stay, basically think about your escape routes. You really should have two ways, work out two ways out of your property, especially if you're trying to get horses somewhere, two ways of where different places you could take them. Okay, because one can easily be cut off. Okay, then you need to know what conditions will actually put those escape routes at risk. Because again, if something's going to affect your escape routes, you might leave way earlier than you would have planned. Okay, the things that besides that is often the direction of the fire, because if a fire is going to pass through really high fuel loads, thick timber or even really tall rank pastures on its way to you, it will be a bigger fire than it would have been somewhere else. And also the topography affects how quickly, and obviously, forestry versus grass will affect how well it burns. Moving your horses may be independent of you defending your property. You might move your horses, but you stay and then defend your house. Or you may have a suitable paddock for your horses and they stay, but if your house is nestled right in amongst all the trees, leave, okay, if your house isn't defendable. Okay, so whether your horses stay or not, it really comes down to whether you've got suitable paddocks, which is what Amy was about. Your paddock should have very low fuel loads, like really short grass. As Canter for Climate, we're advocating keeping your grass longer usually, but I have mown one of my paddocks shorter than I've ever mown my paddocks before, and that's my fire safe paddock. Okay, hopefully it's got nil or very few trees. Have it open so the horses can run. If you've got small paddocks, open all the gates you can to let them run. But as Amy said, never let them out on the road. They're still at risk of fire, but they're also at greater risk of accident with vehicles. There will be cars moving around, emergency service vehicles, there'll be smoke, people may not see them. Your horse is safest on your property than out on a road. Now, in a perfect world, you'd also have a lovely big dam. Horses can stand in a dam and have a fire go around them and cope quite well. Okay. Now, again, your decision on whether you go or not is you've got to assess your fire. Okay, there are almost all states now have intensity or fire hazard ratings. All these things that the Canberra fires and then the Black Sunday fires later got started, and then obviously our Black Summer fires have got all the states really, really good at getting this information out to people. So find out where that information is made available and keep an eye on it, okay? Then obviously work out the direction of travel. Okay, because obviously different fires from different directions will influence whether you leave, you know, and you might stay for a medium or high or even a severe danger fire if your property is, well, you know, can be easily defended. However, in catastrophic conditions, almost no property is defendable, and I'll go into explaining that later. Fires from different directions will pose different risks, okay? You can cut off your escape routes, as we talked about, and the intensity of it will change. And the other thing is to keep an eye on the forecast for wind changes. I'll go into all that now, okay? So as a firefighter, you learn really quickly what a slight increase in wind can do to a fire, okay? You're in a particularly sparse paddock, you know, pasture paddock with a gentle breeze. You're just facing a fire that's creeping towards you, only 1/2 metre flame height. We just stand there and hose it, okay? The wind increases to 20 kilometres an hour, which is not a super strong wind. You are now facing a fire that you can't outwalk in rough terrain, and the flame height could be up to 2 metres. At this point in Queensland Rural Fire, we walk away. We do not, well, we stop any frontal attack of that fire. We either go back to fighting the flanks or we go to back burning from further away. Okay, but in higher winds, you know, in the severe conditions, this results in really fast moving fires, and often the flames can be almost horizontal, which means they will skip across even really wide fire breaks. So we can't even start back burning then, okay? Because without severe backup, like lots of vehicles backing you up, and preferably aerial, because you can just start a back burn, it just jumps the fire break you're starting it on, and all you've done is start the fire 5 kilometres closer to who you're trying to defend, okay? But so in those severe conditions, we often can't control the fire, and all we do is go into defending assets and houses and stuff. In catastrophic conditions, we just go to saving lives. You often can't even attempt to defend houses, okay? And often that's driven by wind speed and temperature and humidity. But wind speed's the one that changes the fastest usually. Now, slopes, this is this thing about the topography of where you live. For every 10-degree increase in slope, a fire will double its speed of travel. So a 20-degree slope, the fire will travel 4 times faster uphill, but it will just creep downhill, okay? So again, which direction your fire's coming from is what speed it's going to be coming at you. Now, your different vegetation types, you know, obviously a grass fire can maybe have much lower flames, but they can move very fast. Fires on a forest floor are usually a lot slower, but obviously once that fire crowns up into a forest, they're coming at you fast with huge flame heights, like 20, 30 metre flame heights in the fires in the black summer fires down in New South Wales. Okay. Just trying to, yeah.
And I'll just give you a time called a time check too, Diana.
I've just got a couple more. Yeah. A forest that's burnt can burn again, that's all. So a fire front, you get a wind change, you know, you've got a 1 kilometre fire front, you get a wind change, you can have a 10 kilometre fire front, okay? So that's why I'm really pushing, keep an eye on your fire fronts. Preparing your property, I won't go into all this, it's all in our fact sheet, it's the sorts of things. But the one I will stress is consider putting a gate in your boundary fences. One, it gives horses or all livestock a chance to move around, which increases their risk of survival, their chance of survival, but also makes it way easier for the rural firefighters to get around properties and fight fires. Okay. And the other one is with preparing your horses, you've got to know, are you going to stay or are you going to go? Okay, there are quite different things. But the main thing is if they're staying, well, probably even if they're going, because the idea, you know, identifying all the horses when they're all bundled in together. But if you're going to put the number on your horse, put it on the body, not write it on the hoof, as you see suggested sometimes. You want to be able to see it from a distance. If your horses get out, people want to be able to ring you, and I'm sure you want them to ring you, okay? The other one is it's very important you've actually confirmed that where you want to take them will actually be happy to accept them. There are situations where, you know, they're just not prepared. Okay. So the point is you want to plan and you want to practice, as Amy pointed out. And if that's, you know, if you get all that right, you can certainly make life less stressful and gives you the best chance of saving your horses. I will now hand over to Rebecca to cap up. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Diana.
You're on mute, Rebecca.
Yes, I was just going to...
Isn't that annoying? I beg your pardon. So just to reiterate that fact sheet that Diana is talking about, both the fact sheet and your own personalised preparation sheet for bushfires are on the Canter for Climate website and able to be downloaded, plus a number of other fact sheets and a series of profiles of people who are managing their grass in a really positive way. And I think, Amy, have you put the links up there in the chat box yet? You will. She's just in the process of doing that. So listen, thank you so much. And it's terrific to be able to hand over to Dr. Lidwien-Verdegaal to take us forward into the horses and heat. Thank you very much.
Unmute. That's a good one. First, unmute. Does everybody see my screen? Yeah, great. You can hear me. Great. Yeah, just a different subject, but it is still related to climate change. And thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really honored to talk about my favorite subject, which is thermoregulation. Let me see if I can forward. Yes. So just really short introduction. My accent is Dutch. I come from the Netherlands and studied at Utrecht University, where I also did my specialist training. But my fascination for exercise in hot circumstances really happened when I was living in the Middle East. I lived in Jordan and in Kuwait, a total of 8 years. And then I moved in 2011 to Australia. And here I'm lecturing, teaching students, but also started a part-time PhD in with Ghent University in Belgium to research or to investigate heat stress and thermoregulation in exercising horses. This is just showing that we are dealing with global warming. This is a beat to heat slogan from the Olympics in Tokyo. This is from the FEI, and this is the one from humans. And this one in Tokyo was the hottest games ever. So this is where the elite sport met the current climate crisis. And we know there's a global warming, as you can see in this diagram. The temperature changes over time from blue to red, and red being the 38 degrees Celsius, and therefore at higher risk for heat stress, developing heat stress. And we've all experienced the catastrophic events, the flooding and the bushfires globally. An important aspect of the climate change are the sudden heat waves. And that means that horses or any athletes are not acclimatized to the hot weather. And the acclimatization normally takes about 2 weeks. So this is a disturbing picture of a horse collapsing due to heat stroke. This is at a racetrack in eastern part of Australia. And this is a situation we wish to prevent. And this is also when the injuries and the fatalities occur, when the general public and the animal welfare associations are quick to critique and condemn the horse sport and also racing events. And the public increasingly calls for safeguarding the welfare of the horses. And that brings up actually the question, should athletes actually be permitted to exercise and compete in hot weather? And do we need to adjust the hot weather policies in event of heat waves? So the heat stress is a term which we commonly use to identify that the thermoregulation system face difficulties and the core body temperature increases. And so this is with increasing severity from heat stress to heat illness, and then followed by exertional heat stroke. So exertional just related to exercise. And those, the heat illness is presented by becoming more wobbly, which we see in humans, but also in horses. And then eventually horses or human athletes collapse. In fact, the exertional heat stroke is amongst the top three causes of sudden death in competing human athletes in the USA. So what is the importance of heat stress? How often does it occur? Well, we know in endurance horses that exhaustion or metabolic disorders are present, and they vary between 2 and 15% of all endurance horses in competitions. When we look at the prevalence of exertional heat illness in racehorses, it's only recently that some countries looked at the heat stress in racehorses. And it varies from 0.1 in the UK, which is just recently reported, in Japan up to 1.1. And we have looked at the race horse factors in a study which we are about to publish, about 0.5%, and another study reported 9.5%. And that was from Meg Brownlow. She looked at the prevalence in hot summer months in Queensland, and she reported also the very low level of heat stress, which we, I think, often miss in our reporting. And I'll touch base on those low-level ones. First, I want to focus on thermoregulation. So what's happening? So we have receptors in the skin and in the internal organs which supply input to the brain and the hypothalamus center. And there's a set point which should be the normal temperature. So if the body is too cold, there's a change in behavior, so the motor output. But if we concentrate on when the temperature is too high, when the body temperature is too high, the behavior would change. So horses would move to a more shady area. The blood flow to the skin increases, which is displayed in this picture. And also the horses start, this is a horse which comes out of an eventing event, and obviously breathing really, really fast to dissipate the heat. So the aim of thermoregulation from any body, from a human athlete or an equine athlete, is the homeostasis of the temperature, of the body temperature. And this is between reference values. I always keep the 38.0 degrees Celsius as the upper limit. And the ideal homeostasis is within a thermoneutral zone. So if you look at this graph, between 5 degrees and 25 degrees Celsius, that would be the thermoneutral zone of a horse, and that's when the metabolic rate is independent from the ambient temperature. I hope that makes sense. But then we also have a thermal comfort zone. So that is when the body feels cold or hot, and we don't know this zone. This can be different for every individual horse, but that's explained by this green area. So as an example, when it's 30 degrees Celsius, the humans might still feel okay if you're acclimatized the body with this temperature, but horses will actually feel too hot already at that time. And in the opposite, if it's 10 degrees Celsius, horses will still feel comfortable while we are probably really feeling cold. So these are things to keep in mind when we deal with different ambient temperatures and different species. So if we think of the thermal comfort of a horse, especially during exercise, we're dealing with different risk factors or different factors. We have the relative humidity, so a hot and humid environment will decrease the thermal comfort. Radiation, so sun, solar, when exercising, as in this picture, in an open air, that is a gain of temperature, of heat load to the body. And then we have the wind, and obviously during exercise, we have an increase of the metabolic rate, and that's influenced by factors such as breed and the diet. So this small graph is just showing you that the thermal comfort is depending on many different factors. And this one is, for example, in green, that's when the body is comfortable. At a temperature of 24 degrees Celsius, for example, if there's a lot of wind, the body might feel cold. If there's just little wind, it might feel comfortable. So just to create a little bit of more awareness that we're not just dealing with the body temperature itself, but also with thermal comfort, which is important for the welfare of the horses. So those horses are obviously not suffering from heat stress, but they might be uncomfortable. So then we go to the thermoregulation during exercise, the area of where I also did where we did our investigations. Obviously, there's a heat gain, and that's really due to the muscle contraction. There's a chemical energy which is exchanged to mechanical energy. And I always say that the horse and also the human athlete has a poor engine. So 80% of that energy is released as heat. And that really depends on the exercise, on the exercise intensity. So in racehorses, for example, they have a very high intensity, use a lot of oxygen, and so there's a high production of metabolic heat, versus endurance horses, which they might not use a lot of oxygen during that time of exercise, but there's a long duration, so still a high production of metabolic heat. Hope that makes sense. So what's involved to dissipate that metabolic heat? Mainly evaporation of sweat, and that's the same to human beings. We and horses, we sweat, and there's just a few low percent which the heat is dissipated through evaporation, through the breathing. Just another remark again, that the solar radiation can heat the body up to 15% as an extra heat load. And there are other methods of the exchange of heat between different surfaces, but they are of minor importance in horses. So this might look complicated, but I just wanted to show what processes are involved in developing the heat stress. And I always like to identify 3 areas. First, we have the thermoregulation, so that's normal. The body increases the blood flow to the skin. It means there's less blood flow to the gut. And in a more severe state, when the body becomes dehydrated, they might develop a leaky gut, which then results in a severe inflammation through the body. The second area is that when the temperature increases, so the thermoregulation processes are not adequate, there's a breakdown of different cells, which then also results in inflammation, but also results in the decreased blood flow to the brain. And that might be resulting in those neurological disorders. So in blue, these might be the most commonly appearing in endurance horses, and the neurological signs, so the wobbly horses, more commonly in race horses. But it's all ends up in when progressing in horses with heat stroke. And it's important to note that this can happen in a really short time. So again, in horses, so in general, those horses, it might not surprise you, when there's development of heat stress, the performance is compromised and the horses will look exhausted. In endurance horses, we see most commonly the metabolic disorders, which is quite similar to this distressing picture as in marathon runners. When they pass the finish, they vomit, and a similar digestive tract abnormality occurs in horses when they are stretching and showing colic signs. In racehorses, we have, as I said, more neurological signs. The gait becomes very wobbly, which is similar to between humans and horses. And I've mentioned before that and that's what I wanted to mention also here, that these are very clear signs, overt signs, but that's probably just the tip of the iceberg, because of the less severe clinical signs are not recognized. And that's level 1 and 2. Horses become more irritated, they might be kicking in an abnormal way. So those are the ones I think we often miss, as in recognizing that is a sign of heat stress. In endurance horses, but also in other disciplines such as eventing, the horses, they do sweat a lot, of course, similar to humans, but the sweat of horses is more hypertonic. So they lose a lot of electrolytes, including sodium. And sodium is the one which triggers the thirst response. And we all know the old English proverb that you can lead a horse to water, but you cannot make it drink. So that's one of the reasons. So horses become then dehydrated, show colic signs due to some of the horses, they lose up to 10 to 15 liters of sweat an hour, and then require intensive care treatment or with IV fluids. Just a short message on what's the treatment, and that is also aligned with the previous note on bushfire cases. If a horse would be presented with heat stress, with heat stroke, but also with bushfire injuries, the best method to cool is to start cooling right away, and just pouring buckets of water over the entire body. And there's also recent research that is the best way to cool down the body, as a minimum of 10 to 20 minutes. In general, how to manage your horse is to really rehydrate, offer isotonic drinking water, and eventually they might require IV fluids. There's also one study which investigated pre-cooling the horses prior to exercise, and that's a method which is used commonly in human athletes. Am I doing in matters of time? Is that okay? I hope so, yeah. So now I come to the interesting part, I think, at least. This is my PhD research, which I completed in 2022. And the title was Thermoregulation in Exercising Horses, the Aspects of Temperature Monitoring During Field Exercise. And I initiated this PhD research in collaboration with Ghent University. And it's really that in earlier studies, there were there are well-reported studies which used laboratory-based investigations, and they used a treadmill and more invasive temperature measurement methods. And I wanted to know, how does the core temperature actually evolve in real time during field exercise? So we use this temperature pill, which is a small pill, like a vitamin pill, and which is already used in humans. And in the first study, we validated the pill by using it in the horse. And in the second study, which was a huge study, we compared endurance horses to trotters. I'll explain a little bit more. So this is the pill, travels through the digestive tract. And this was the study we did. Can't see all the, yeah, I can see. And the temperature is measured by a device, which is, this is used for humans, and we adjusted that for the use in horses. So we showed that it is possible to measure the gut temperature in horses, and we compared it to the rectal temperature. And we concluded that this pill is actually quite practical and accurate method to measure the core body temperature. So then when we've once we have done that, we launched this large study together with Ghent University, and we used all innovative and non-invasive monitoring tool. We used a pill. We monitored the heart rate, the speed, and the ambient temperature. And we compared endurance horses over time, over 100 or 120 Ks, and the trotter horses just over 1,500 meters. So these are the graphs, the scatter plots, which came out of that study. But if we just concentrate on 2 examples, on the left side in a black line is the body temperature, on the right side is the temperature accumulated in the body. And the gray area is the period of exercise. And on the right side, we have a trotter. So in red is the fast exercise of the trotters. And just by eyeballing those graphs and also the previous graphs, it is easy to see that every horse has a very individual temperature profile. And that was the important finding we had. So it's not one setup for all horses. Every horse had a different profile. And that's also presented by this box plot. Temperature on the left side again. And these are all the endurance horses. And this is the mean temperature. And you can see with those lines that the temperature in every horse varied over time. And on the right side, we have the trotter horses. So we concluded that a one-fits-all approach for horses in the same discipline even does not safeguard the thermal welfare. And we think that we need an individual passport, a thermal passport for the horse to ensure the welfare. So other findings, just want to highlight a few things, is that the mean temperature of the horses, so the pill temperature, was the same in maximum temperature in endurance horses compared to trotter horses or race horses, but the timing was very different. So endurance horses always during the 40K exercise, and in trotter horses always during the recovery. And what was even more remarkable and a surprise for us is that the temperature of 30% of the trotter horses at the end of the recovery was still higher than 39 degrees Celsius. And another interesting finding was that at the heart rate of 60 beats per minute, which is in Australia now governs the fit to continue the competition in endurance rides, the average body temperature of horses was still 38.8 degrees Celsius, so still increased. So the heart rate was recovered, but the body temperature not. So in conclusion, we had a similar maximum temperature, but very different profile. So the last research I just wanted to mention, and that is really related to the current increase of all kinds of wearables which are on the market. And there's a huge temptation to use all those devices, and they do have data output, but we have to remain critical what does it mean, the data output. So in that sense, we investigated the skin temperature, which we measured over time, and there was a device located in the girth. And again, this was the output in blue, the skin temperature, and in black, the pill temperature. And just highlighting a few of the cases, just concluding that we did some statistical analysis for the different temperatures, and there was no association between the skin temperature in blue and the pill temperature, the core temperature. So just be aware that this is not a good, that skin temperature is not a good proxy for what's going on with the body temperature. So in conclusion, this is the first study to measure the body temperature under field circumstances, and it is important and that we need the individual monitoring of the temperature in horses, how it responds to exercise. And that finding is also consistent with some of the research done in human athletes, especially in marathon runners. They also found that with the same fitness, the human athletes have a very different response. And some of the recommendations from our research is that to be aware that when the heart rate is at 60 beats per minute, the cardiovascular system might be recovered, but the temperature might not be. And then related to the finding of the maximum temperature in racehorses is always occurring during the recovery, which makes sense, obviously. After the fast race, they need to dissipate the heat. But despite the 10 minutes of cooling, the temperature might still be high at 30 minutes. So we might have to increase the time of cooling. And then lastly, the monitoring of the temperature post-exercise should be for at least 60 minutes, and especially to check that temperature before a horse goes on a transport. So in conclusion, also we, and then for the discussion also, we have used this pill, which is reliable, and for the future, we would like to do more studies to investigate cooling pre and post exercise. We like to investigate the temperature profiles in different disciplines, and also investigate the temperature profile in transportation of horses. So the transportation prior to the exercise, but also post exercise. And we're currently lucky to have funding from Ghent University to monitor the temperature of horses being transported in the air. And so that will be very interesting to see what's happening. But future research will also be transport on the road. And we have, first of all, there's a misconception that there's only heat stress happening in hot weather, and especially when there are heat waves, we need to be aware that that heat stress is a risk. And our studies were performed under cool weather circumstances, but these are the baselines for future hot weather events. And we will expand the research to hot weather studies. And also another point I would like to address is that we have no guidelines on how long should horses rest post a heat stress event. And this is in humans very well established. Human athletes, when they had a heat stress period, they are required to rest. They have some follow-up bloods or other examinations, and they need to rehabilitate for a certain period. And that varies between 3 weeks and a year. But for all those studies, we need funding, of course. So let me know if there's any suggestions. For future recommendations, we are currently looking at identifying more risk factors in studies at University of Adelaide and in Ghent. We need to increase the education to recognize actually what are the signs of heat stress, and we need to redefine some of the policies, and they should be based on evidence. And a few of those could be the hot weather policies, and could include mandatory cooling. So I think that monitoring of the core body temperature and other vitals of the individual horse, and to combine that with a shared vision from all of us, are the first steps towards monitoring the equine thermal well-being in the field, and that in the context of the climate change. And of course, I'm not doing this on my own. So I would like to thank my colleagues in the research group and also the colleagues in the comparative physiology research group at Ghent University. The endurance riders, which helped me enormously, and lots of students. And I thank you very much for your attention. I'm really curious for to hear all your questions.
Thank you much. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. The gastrointestinal pill as a way of monitoring temperature is super cool. So that was great. Thanks for sharing all that information. We do have a few questions in the chat, so I might get started with those, but then if anyone has a question, just feel free to unmute yourself and shout out in between the questions, or you can put them in the chat and I'll read them out. Okay, so first question from Rebecca. There is a perception that you must scrape the horse of water when trying to cool them down. Is there any evidence that this makes a difference? So using our sweat scrapers, I think, is what Rebecca's asking about.
Yeah, really the best question, and we have had so many discussions about it. So there's just a recent study which looked at what is the best way to cool the body down in cases of heat stress, and they found they also compared scraping and non-scraping, and they found that to answer that question, which we're always talking about, that it's not necessary to scrape of the water. And I think in one way, it just really makes sense. If the temperature is really, really high, don't want to lose any time with the scraping of the water. And I think in practice, and I've joined many endurance rides, if it's really hot and you don't have too much water, as in flowing water over the body, so you have a few buckets and then the water stays on, it makes sense to scrape off the water. Because that water heats up when it's on the skin, and then if you scrape it off, you can replace it with other water. Does that make sense? So if the horses are really in heat stress, don't take the time to scrape it off. But that's with the ideal circumstances that you have a hose with cold water, or hundreds and hundreds of liters of water, which was used in that study. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have that, I think it still makes sense to scrape it off if you just have very little water, or if the water is already warm.
Yeah, okay, that's great. That makes sense. Another question about if horses are fitter, so the fitter the horse, are they better able to withstand heat?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, so there's a whole list of risk factors, and I didn't touch base on that. But the fitter the horse, the better, the less risk it is to develop heat stress, and then ideal to create the fitness or to train during the weather where the horse is going to exercise in the weather circumstances. So that's important. I think that's one thing we'd like to further investigate, but most of the racehorses, for example, they train early in the morning while the race is much later. So they are still not acclimatized to the temperature which they're going to exercise under. But just in general, fitness does help. Yeah.
Cool. I think that actually helps to answer Rebecca's next question, was how do you develop your own individual horse's capacity to tolerate heat? Is there anything else you can do apart from train them in the right conditions?
Yeah, train them in the right conditions. Yeah.
Just to interrupt, it wasn't your own individual horse's capacity, but how you know what their heat signature is, your passport. Like you might have 3 fit horses, but how are you going to measure that easily?
Yeah. So I like measuring, indeed. So I would even take the rectal temperature of your every individual horse to get to know your own horse. Heart rate is a really good monitor to also observe the respiratory rate, but also the way of breathing. It's not only the rate itself, but as I showed in that video, if they are really kind of not panting, but really recovering slower. And then just to get to know your own individual horse. So if it's a high temperature, you start cooling the horse and take the temperature again after 10 or 30 minutes. And taking the temperature is also a good thing to teach your horse, so that it's really, even when it's stressed, that you're able to take the temperature.
Does that answer your question, Rebecca? Yeah. Cool. We have a question from Janet. She asks, should animal welfare legislation in all states and territories require the duty of care responsibilities of owners of animals, including owners of horses, to include an awareness of the consequences of climate change?
Well, that's a long question. Ideally, yes, and that's I think. So my aim would be to actually investigate and to find more evidence to prove that we need more individual monitoring for the horses. So it's not just, oh, this is the wet bulb temperature and we have to cancel this competition, for example.
Mhm.
But also, yeah, the duty of care I think is already with the owners. Is that what is the question? I think we all have a duty of care to know our individual horses, and I hope in the future that there will be a policy change that it's more clearly stated that it's not one fits all, as I said, but that still individuals, even if the heart rate is, for example, back to 60 beats per minute, one individual horse can still have a high temperature. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think we can improve over time, I hope, in the light also of climate change, to improve those hot weather policies. And I would say maybe to include something like a heat wave. It's the typical one, for example, in Melbourne, that the temperature is cool, and then suddenly heat wave, and then that's when those, especially the racehorses, end up with collapsing after the race because they're just not adapted.
Mm.
Oh yeah, that would be a good discussion. Yeah.
I don't know if Janet's there, but does that answer your question, Janet? She might not be there. If anyone else has any questions for any of our speakers tonight, don't hesitate to come off mute. Oh, there you are, Janet. Did we answer your question?
Yes, I think any answer in relation to changing the legislation can only be broad, and yes, definitely require further information. But it does interest me, or it does interest me as to whether the animal welfare legislation in all the different states and territories will, at some stage, start picking up and recognizing climate change and the consequences of it, whether it's heat or whether it's floods and the need to have a plan, whatever it is. I think it should be in there eventually.
Yeah. Well, the first challenge is that every state still has their own hot weather policies, which surprised me, but that's obviously what happens. So that's number one. We need to align in all the different, to align all the hot weather policies. Yeah.
I think Ruth put up her hand, but now maybe she's gone. Oh no, there you are, Ruth.
No,
Do you have a
I'm
question?
still
yeah.
here. Yeah. No, that was a fantastic talk, Lidwien. Enjoyed it very much. I know very little about horses, so I learned a lot tonight.
Okay.
As Lidwien knows, but the rest of you don't, I'm also from the Netherlands, and something that really surprised me here, Lidwien, is that so many horses are rugged or wear a blanket. And as a Dutch person in Australia, I think it's awfully warm here. So to put blankets on these poor horses, to me, looks like a welfare issue. But it's probably not perceived that way here. So from a thermoregulation perspective, is there a difference in set point between Australian horses and Dutch horses? And what do you think about rugs and thermoregulation?
Excellent question, Rod. Nice to see you. I did actually write a piece which I might share with the group for the rescue center, and that's related with blankets, shade, and all those questions which are important. I hope you all understand that, well, we don't have a different set point for temperature in horses in Australian horse compared to the Netherlands. But I hope from the presentation that everybody understands that the evaporation is the only way, or up 80 to 90%, the method for horses to dissipate the heat. So if you put a blanket on that horse, it's not able to dissipate that heat. And it is, I think, such a tradition, and seems to be like a thing to care for the horses to put a blanket on it, but that's definitely not helpful. And there's also some research out there which prove that. So it's a very good point, Ruth.
So even a cotton in hot, humid weather?
So if that horse is hot at that time, it cannot dissipate the heat. So the heat of the sweat cannot dissipate. So it cannot. It's not the optimal situation to sweat.
Okay. And does horse color? Sorry. Does horse color play an issue? Have an impact?
Yeah, I looked at it in our investigation, and I don't think we had the numbers, but there's a few research reports that the coat color makes a difference, and it's clear because the darker coat does absorb more of the solar radiation than the lighter horses. Yeah.
So in Queensland, a lot of people, if they've got a bay horse, they will say by putting a light coloured rug on it, they're actually helping it. A lot of those rugs are mesh. They're not a cloth, so we're still trying to let them, sweat through them, that sort of thing. Are people doing the right thing with the mesh rugs on, a white mesh rug on a dark bay horse or not?
Well, I think if the horses cool down after that, it's fine. But when the horses are cooling down, or when you're cooling them with pouring water over the body, it's not necessary.
No, this is when
and the heat is already sorry.
This is when they're just in the paddock, in a 32-degree day.
Okay, no, that's fine. That's fine. It's just something to keep in mind, that they can't sweat as well as when there's no rug on them. So I think the difference between solar radiation in dark coat versus light coat is not as important as the ability to be able to sweat, because horses are quite smart. If there's shade, they will always move to a shady area. That will be my conclusion, my answer at this point.
Lynn also had a colic question that I'm just going to prompt for her. I think what was the specifics of it? Yes, eating after heat, and you've been cooling them down with the water. If they eat, are they more likely to get colic in response from the heat exposure?
So it's a good question. And I'm saying that because if the horse really cool down and they have normal gut sounds, eating hay is really encourage them to drink more. So that's also well proven. If you provide hay or lucerne, when after eating hay, the thirst response is increased, and they will drink more. I would say if the horse is really dehydrated, anyway, the gut sounds will be less. And that is really because there's less blood flow to the gut, and then I would just withhold from giving food until they are really recovered from that.
I also have another question. It's been suggested to me that on the day of a hot travel, for example, that you actually put extra salt into their morning feed, for example, so that they are much. That's the right approach. So
that's
they
a good approach.
Actively hydrate themselves.
Yes, so that they have eventually a higher sodium level, and that will kind of prompt the thirst response, and they will drink more. So that's a good way. We are looking at electrolyte supplementation in horses because it's a common tradition in endurance horses. We're actually looking at how much you should give, and maybe also to expand it to other disciplines. Yeah.
So, sorry, one more question. So here on the mid-north coast, I'm in Taree, or close to. The recommendation that we were given was 60 grams of salt just in average feed per day. And then if we're going to a competition like an endurance ride, we do a paste with applesauce and salt extra on the day that we travel. Is that something you'd agree with?
Yeah, I agree with the daily electrolyte amount of electrolyte supplementation also obviously depends on the rest of the diet, and then increase it on the day of endurance. That's a really good habit. The apple syrup and is based on that the horses are already used to take the paste, and it might be a little bit more tasty for them to actually eat swallow that paste. And there's even some research done that they compared the different water. They compared the water intake, and one bucket with some apple syrup and electrolytes, and the drink water at room temperature that had the highest water intake. So to train your horses to actually drink a little bit, so the warmer water, which is probably anyway the case in endurance events, when we don't have all the cold water, is a good thing to do too. Yeah.
So apple stroop's my go-to because I'm Dutch as well. We share a first name. But the other thing was I was going to ask about salt. So our suggested was 1 part potassium chloride with 3 parts sodium chloride. Yes?
Yeah. So most of the time we say 2/3 sodium chloride and 1/3 potassium chloride, but it's around that area, and that's the similar concentration as the concentration of those electrolytes in the plasma in the blood. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm just conscious of the time. We have 1 more minute, so I think we'll wrap it up there. Cannot thank our incredible presenters enough for the amount of useful information that you've shared with us tonight, along with your personal experiences. That can't have been easy, but completely valuable, and we appreciate that so much. Everyone watching this, including people that watch this in their own time at a later date, will absolutely be taking some of that crucial information and tips away from this presentation. As I mentioned at the start of this presentation, I'll be uploading this recording to our website as well as our YouTube channel, and I will include all the links that Canter for Climate has shared with us, as well as the links to their amazing fact sheets. So once again, thank you to our amazing volunteer, Simone, and our incredible presenters as well. And thank you everyone for attending this presentation tonight. If you did want to volunteer with VFCA, you can reach us at www.vfca.org.au/volunteer. But without further ado, thank you all, and we'll end the meeting here.
Thank you. Thank you for the good questions.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Bye.